Hello everybody, my name is Parkinson from the University of Huddersfield and I'm here to deliver this presentation on how cyberattacks can facilitate deceptive behaviour in planning. So first of all, just to set the scene, I'll just provide the outline of what's to come, and I position this in the form of 5 questions. The first one is, what is deception in planning and why should it be considered? Then we have a look at what are the different types of deceptive behaviours, how can these deceptive behaviours affect planning-based systems, how can cyberattacks enable deceptive behaviours, and then mitigation is obviously challenging, understanding and prioritization is needed, but how can we do this? So first of all, let's have a look at what deception is. So deception is the process or act of causing someone to accept as true or valid something which is false or invalid, the act of deceiving. So let's have a think about who's performing this deception in our system. So when we're looking from the security angle, really we're saying that we've got an adversary, somebody who is opposing and resisting and wants to deceive us to gain something of their own benefit. Now, deception in some capacity is everywhere, and I put this image in, which you're probably all very familiar with, which is obviously a fast food restaurant with their photos of what the products look like, and then underneath is the reality of what you actually get. And this, in some ways, deceiving the customer to believe they're getting something they're not, to trick them to buy it. Things look better than they actually are. This is perhaps not too malicious because the consequences are low. What the product actually tastes like is probably good enough to satisfy the customer anyway. But the fact is there are some differences. And it's a very common thing for us to do in our daily lives, right? Research identifies that the three major reasons to why people lie are, to get something they want, to protect or promote themselves, or to harm others on the adversary side there. When we think about who's doing this, we often categorise them into 3 types, really. We've got the individuals, we've got the malicious groups, or the hacktivists, and then we've got the governments. So when we're thinking specifically in terms of security, the individuals we could say are, the Lone Ranger, the teenager in the bedroom launching some attacks that are easy to do. The malicious group could be a group of sort of highly capable people who are launching attacks for political, economic reasons, which could be of ethical consideration. So the group Anonymous could fall there, and then governments, obviously state-sponsored. Cyber attacks are quite common now, and some of these are obviously going to be initiating deceptive behaviours to get into systems to perform what they want to do. So let's now have a think about deception and autonomous systems and why it's important, right? Well, autonomous systems are, they're pretty much everywhere now, right, in some form, whether we're thinking in terms of planning here or more sort of statistical-based machine learning systems that are doing more classification tasks. Some form of automation is everywhere, right? And that means that it becomes a target because it's the gateway really for somebody to have some undesired impact on the system. There's a platform there for them to launch an attack against. It's used in an ever-increasing variety of applications. When we're talking in applications there, we could be looking at things such as power management, through to manufacturing, through to cyber defense operations. It's in a whole range of different application areas. Some of them are obviously, have greater consequence than others, but they're all a target. And when we're performing automation, we're often performing it based on sort of large-scale data and reasoning problems. So a lot of the time, automation's in place either to overcome some of the challenges that make it hard for humans to handle, such as things like traffic management, cyber defense, where there's a lot of data to handle and processes need to be reacted upon very quickly, or it could be where we're looking to replace human operators or complement them, where there's still a large amount of data, but having the automation there is beneficial. An example of that could be manufacturing or logistics. One of the challenges is that they are difficult to monitor. A lot of times we don't necessarily know what's going on inside them, which means it can be quite difficult to foresee when something strange has suddenly happened. We might see the output in what's going on with the automation system, but we might not make the connection between the attack, right? And that can be quite challenging to do. And then the final one, which is always the case with all systems when we're considering security, and that's the attacker always has the first mover advantage. Given enough time and resources, they can always find a weakness. Whereas somebody designing and implementing the system probably can't foresee everything that's coming. So I mentioned a little bit about the high consequences, and I put this image in here because a theme that's going to go throughout this talk is probably around traffic management, because it provides a relatable application to consider. Safety and economic consequences are always high when we're looking at some large-scale automation systems. Think of traffic, for example, or vehicle routing. The implications of being able to attack the automation system and change what it's doing can be very significant when we're looking at safety. A vehicle in itself is quite a large weapon, and if it can be abused, then the attacker could potentially want to do that to cause some damage. So the consequences are high. Sometimes safety may not be the primary consequence. It could be mainly economic. So, for example, like sea exploration or space exploration, where we've got robotics operating in hostile environments, that might not be critical to human life, but if it goes wrong, the economic consequences are very high. Time is lost and it's expensive. So for an adversary, they can be desirable targets, really. So there is a need to consider in more detail the deceptive actions that could be presented against the system to try to mitigate them. So if we just have a quick recap on planning systems before we look at some deceptive examples and some cyber attacks that could initiate them. Let's just recap the fact that a planning system, we've got knowledge, we've got the model that we're using, the domain knowledge, and then we've got some data observations coming in there. We're often going to be performing some actions, we're generating actions to get to some goal, and this is going to be an iterative process as things change, right? It's a process that will change over time. It could be an offline planning system, where things are static. The domain model is provided in advance. The data is provided in advance in a static state. We produce a plan, get to the goal, and we're happy. We don't need to do any replanning. But most likely, a lot of the systems which are going to be targeted by or desirable target for somebody wanting to cause damage are going to be online, where data is observed, feeds into the next iteration, as the goal is updating. So just to break that down a little bit further, this is probably an image that you're all familiar with seeing in the past, where we've got different aspects of our planning system, where we've got the description of the system, which feeds into a planner with some initial state and some objectives. That will generate plans, which then the controller is going to generate actions based upon some observation of the system, and the system will take in events from the outside world, if you like, that will feed back in, and then the loop will continue. So it's an iterative process where we're looking to plan for some objectives provided and some knowledge of the system. Now, just to highlight a few parts of this, which are quite important really for this talk and the consideration around deception, really we're interested in the model. Okay, so we've got our description of the domain. We've got some data coming in on the sort of the initial state, and then we've got data and potentially model updates which are initiated by some events coming in. And these are the sort of the 3 points which throughout this presentation are quite key. Because what we're really interested in considering now is that planning systems often involve elements of being data-driven or model-based. So the model-based reasoning is obviously where we're trying to rationalise with the knowledge that we have and the goal we're trying to achieve, and try to plan a sequence of actions to reach that. Whereas the data-driven approaches, we've often got a lot of data which can be used then to decide or be used to rationalise, maybe with a more simple domain description of how we can plan to organise something that's dependent on that data structure. So just to give you a few examples then going forward, which are quite important. The first one, if we think about the data-driven approaches, we often refer to this in security as the sort of the feature space. So these are the features which are integral to the application and open potentially to being abused. So I've got 3 images here. The first one on the left, we're just looking at a sort of traditional traffic management system. where we're sort of thinking of some things which are open to being manipulated. So we've got sensors on vehicles, we've got the traffic management controller in the middle and the communication between them. All these different points provide sort of a feature of the system which can be vulnerable to attack. Then we've got a more focused image in the middle where we're looking at the different communication protocols that could exist in a sort of collaborative vehicle environment where we've got vehicle-to-vehicle communication going on. We've got sort of different satellite communication, we've got different sensors which are related to distance measurement, and then also communication with infrastructure. These are obviously all parts of traffic management. So this slide is related purely to traffic management, if you've not realised, or autonomous vehicles as well. The one on the right then, we're even more detailed, where we're sort of drilling down on the level, where we're looking here at some of the individual aspects within a vehicle, right? Some of the communication channels that exist between the sensors that are on the vehicle going into the central controller, which could then feed to the outputs. So you notice there's a lot of things in here, such as speed. We've got individual switches. We've got things to do with gear positions. All these individual devices are generating data which can come in as inputs to our control system and then be outputs too. And in terms of the security, both these can be manipulated in the same way, right? We can potentially intercept and change values on the output and also on the input. And the same over in the middle, we can modify these communication channels, and this is where the potential attack vectors can be launched against. So then if we just have a think about the action space then, and how we could potentially manipulate what's going on in terms of planning. If we have a very simple example where we have a vehicle aiming to get to a goal over here, and the planning system is basically to optimize the route through the network, and there are some known things going on in the network, roadworks, we've got traffic lights, we've got road congestion. Well, there's a potential here that we can manipulate it to influence which actions are selected, right? So these roadworks, for example, might not be here in the middle. It might be our sole objective to introduce those roadworks to cause the planner to change the vehicle's route to go around it so that we can have a more optimal route through it. So we'd be looking to deceive it. So the action space really is the obviously the actions that could be planned to solve this problem. We might want to manipulate that to our advantage, and most likely the way we're going to do that is through the data. So now if we have a think about different types of deception. Now once again, these examples here providing are all based on linking them back to the traffic example, just because it's it's a relatable use of automation. But I might at some point discuss some other different applications as well. So in this presentation then, I'm presenting 3 types of deception, right, which are based on some work we've done in a recent publication, which I'll mention at the end, where we built on a military classification model, looking how they define deceptive behaviours in military combat and the different sort of dimensions they use to classify them. So there's more detail on these coming on the next slide, but just to give you an overview before we start, these can be defined really in sort of their longevity, so whether they're short or long-term deceptive actions, and whether they're passive or active, so how much involvement is often needed by the attacker. So if we just have a look at these one by one, so first of all, let's have a look at suppression. So when I'm talking about these dimensions or these different deceptive behaviours, I'm really positioning them in terms of their relation to data and how we can then manipulate that data in a security attack, which comes later. So the first one then, if we think about suppression in terms of data, we're really thinking now about how we can subdue the feature space. So that data that's been collected, whether it's from a vehicle or whether it's inside the vehicle, we want to subdue the feature space to manipulate the observations in the planning system, resulting in incorrect action choice. So this could, for example, be to remove signals being communicated in the vehicle or remove communication that's coming from the vehicle by blocking it to prevent it going to the controller, which then the controller doesn't know what that vehicle is intending to do or relating data back to it. So then it's going to make an incorrect planning choice based upon it. So a very simple and relatable example here is about congestion. Making the network appear less congested than it really is to result in rerouting or false information being relayed to the user. So if the network appears to be a lot quieter than it actually is, this could end up the user unfortunately being redirected into the traffic, which is a problem for them. But for the adversary launching this deceptive attack, they could benefit from that because they could be keeping a route deliberately clear. So if we have a think about overloading, so overloading's that's similar but on the opposite really, where we look to overload the feature space by introducing more data to result in incorrect actions. So this could be to deliberately provide repetitive data into the system to confuse it, to make it think that routes are more busy than they perhaps are. Third one is mistakes. So this one might not necessarily be resulting from a highly technical sort of attack. This could just be exploiting something which is known to be at fault within the system. So if somebody really understands how the system behaves, they could perhaps realise that there's some kind of mistake there which is open to abuse. So this could be, for example, transmitting erroneous data through the system, which is generated through a breach of security, negligence, or inefficiency. And the result of this could be, I suppose, that somebody might want to do any of the things we've mentioned already about trying to get a more beneficial route through the network. Substitution, this one we're looking to deliberately modify the feature space to result in different action choice. So this one's where we've kind of got this sort of man in the middle where we'd be looking to intercept the data and modify it, right, to change it as it's coming through. So this could be to change things such as vehicle speed, it could be vehicle position, and we want to change how that goes into the system, and that could obviously then influence the action choice. Target conditioning is a little bit more challenging and long term. So this would be where we'd be looking to change any sort of adaptive behaviour within the system through repetitive training. So we'd be looking to gradually introduce data into the system which makes it believe that something is normal, and that could then be something that in the future it would expect to see. So it could be sort of a very gradual change of behaviour which could have significant consequences. A good example of this, which actually we see in routing, vehicle routing or route planning using satellite navigation, is through things like GPS spoofing, where we want to gradually attack the victim, if you like, by falsifying GPS transmission to them. And this has to be a very gradual thing, because if you do it too quickly, if you give them a false reading which is too significant against where they should be, obviously it's quite easy to detect. So we've got to gradually do it and very, very slowly over a long time pull them away from their actual position. And this can be achieved. It's just a sort of gradual introduction of fake data. Repackaging capability signatures. So this one could be quite interesting because it's where the attacker might want to present something to the network that is false, right? They might want to introduce an actual infrastructure component, for example, like a traffic monitoring sensor. They might want to simulate that they've introduced one in a specific location to provide really false data to the network, which then could be used to manipulate it into generating false actions. And this obviously would really increase ambiguity in trust within the network, because we would not, from a planning perspective, really understand what we could trust within the network. Amplification is where we'd want to increase the feature space, heighten the variables that are known to be of key importance, right? So this one, similar again, I'm just using this very basic sort of examples here about traffic and congestion, but this one we could be looking to do the same, where we'll be looking to increase the data that's been recorded and stored and transmitted through more variables, right? And there could be more variables coming from different vehicles which we've simulated. Similar again, we could be looking to make the network believe that a specific route is overpopulated and that the user should be redirected elsewhere. And then reinforcing the position. So this one's large-scale manipulation of the feature space to adjust the planner's observation. So this one could be to make the traffic control believe that there are more vehicles taking one course of action when a different one is actually taken. So this could be to make the controller believe that an entire route is heavily populated when in fact it's not, and other people they're going elsewhere. So I've actually got some examples to build on these coming in the next few slides, where we have a look at some specific cyber attacks which could introduce some of these. Now, one thing that's key to all those, you probably realise as I've been going through them, is that really when I've been looking at this in the past, it's all about, or my understanding, my way of looking at it in terms of the security linked to deception and how we can understand them. It's really data generated, right? It's often about changing the data to manipulate what goes on in the system. And there are a few points, if we look back at this description of planning, where we've got the model. Can we actually directly modify the model in the first instance? Most likely the places we're going to look to change, or the adversary is going to look to change, are in the data. So, providing false manipulated readings from the initial state, also provided back into the system through the events, which then hopefully would be able to affect the action choice by providing falsified data in there. So one commonality then between everything I've mentioned so far is that data is of key importance there, and modifying the data within the feature space can really provide us a way to bring about some deceptive behaviours. Furthermore, when we design and develop autonomous systems, reactivity is in our mind. We want to make them flexible. We want to make them handle as wide range of system situations as possible. We don't want one that's overly restrictive, because then obviously it's probably not going to be flexible. So flexibility is always built in. But flexibility itself could be problematic, because that could present the possibility for somebody to manipulate the feature space more easily, right? Because we don't obviously start thinking about our feature space when we design autonomous systems and how it could be misused by an adversary. We're primarily probably thinking in terms of how well the autonomous system can work, its efficiency and reliability, perhaps not how prone it is to deception. So considering vulnerabilities is often always an afterthought. The attack potential against the system is often ignored and only looked at when something goes wrong. And this always gives the attacker the first mover's advantage, where they can, once the system's deployed, spend time to understand it and try to find weaknesses within it. So now let's have a look at security vulnerabilities and how they can fit into this. So vulnerabilities in technology provide the mechanism to interfere and manipulate system functionality to achieve a desired outcome. Now, system vulnerabilities exist in many places, and they're not necessarily always of security concern, right? So it could be something that's seen more as a bug, a feature, or back in the early 2000s, or late 90s, we used to talk about Easter eggs in software, right? Features that existed there which sometimes were deliberate, sometimes were accidental, and you could manipulate the system to do things you want. But these are often open for somebody to try and do something more significant with. And that more significant thing is most likely trying to compromise the security or integrity of the autonomous system to achieve a desired output. They're often discovered by the adversary in the first instance, and then reactively mitigated and patched once somebody reports it, once the exploit becomes known. And this is obviously a slow and problematic process, and this is why security is such a key concern when you've got critical applications. So just a recent example to put in here, which is not really related to autonomous systems, but it shows you how slow things are actually patched and fixed. You might remember the vulnerability discovered back in 2021, with Log4j. So this is part of Java's naming directory interface, where people could quite easily adjust the configuration file to basically put remote code executions in there and have some quite significant impact, where they could start doing whatever they wanted. Really, they could get some high level control of the system through easy mechanisms, right, of just modifying configuration files by code injection. But after 1 year, 70% of the systems have been patched and 30% still aren't. Now, them 30% are obviously very low-hanging fruit and easily accessible for people to try and attack. And that's the problem, because that means that it's very easy for someone to try and do it, and the 30% probably are still unaware that they need to actually update the systems. Furthermore, just to sort of add some more emphasis on it, we see that cyber attacks are increasing, but one of the reasons why they're increasing is because of the monetary impact. This is one significant concern globally, is that the monetary impact of cybercrime or cyber-related attacks is growing significantly. Part of this is what motivates some people to be attacking systems, whether it's looking at exploiting them for their own financial benefit, through things like ransomware. Maybe they're aiming through more company-to-company or state-to-state cybercrime, where they're looking to get advantages by disadvantaging other competitors. There are many reasons as to why people want to focus on launching attacks, but one of them is, with no doubt, money. So now let's have a look at some example attacks against these deceitful behaviours we've had a look at, and the different deceptions, and what their impact could be on the feature space, and also relating to planning. And I've put some images together to try and explain them a bit more clearly. As I'm going through these next slides, you'll notice there's some references in here to the specific attacks mentioned. Now, these references in the publication I mentioned at the end, they can all be found in there if you want to go and have a further dive into the detail of the security attack, because I'm kind of presenting this on a high level where I'm not going into too much detail about the attacks being presented, and I'm just kind of pulling it together to show how these attacks can initiate these sort of deceptive behaviour profiles and what that could mean for a planning system. So the first one we mentioned earlier on about suppression and camouflage. So this is obviously where we're aiming to suppress activity in the system, whether that's to make the transport network appear less congested than it really is, to force sort of rerouting. That is one valid reason as to why I would want to do it. So one example here I've got is a starvation attack. So this one's very much where we've got a vehicle taking a route, but they should not be taking that route because it's actually more congested than they believe, right? So the planning algorithm which was choosing the route for the vehicle should have chosen the alternative viable route, because that one was free and would have been of lower cost. This one here is actually congested, but the information about those vehicles being there has been suppressed to the network by the adversary, which means then the vehicle takes the incorrect choice and ends up in congestion, which is obviously a very undesired outcome for the occupant of that vehicle. Overloading. So this one is where we'd want to, or the adversary would want to overload the system to probably make it very difficult for it to plan the correct choice. So an example which you're all familiar with, like denial of service, where we basically overload a system by providing too much data too quickly, which means it's probably unable to actually plan using it because the updates are coming too fast. So an example here, once again, back to sort of vehicle routing, where we've got some choices to make, but because of the volume of information coming into the planning system, overloading it, we can't provide the vehicle with a valid plan at all, which leaves them then to choose it by themselves, which could be problematic. These are very easy attacks to launch denial of service. A mistake. So mistakes can come through weaknesses in security protocols, right? So I've got an example here around sort of session hijacking. Obviously, the protocols which are used for communication within distributed systems are open to things like session hijacking, where you basically have the sender and the receiver operating over their normal protocols about synchronization and acknowledgement. But if you have an intermediary attacker in there, they can intercept and join the party, if you like, and become part of that trusted authentication channel, which means they can hijack the session and start to do what they want with it. This could be a real compromise on data, because it opens the potential for the attacker to manipulate it in a trusted environment, which could result in the planner making choices based on data which it believes is trustworthy, but actually isn't. And another one slightly linked to that, really, around substitution, is where we'd be looking to change values and go undetected. So it's kind of like the last one, but this one I've put it related to sort of cryptography systems, so where we've got encryption going on, and we've got an intermediary actor, sort of a man in the middle there, where we've got two parties communicating over a standard protocol, right? So this is a standard sort of a shared key protocol where we're distributing random values to start with, if you like, as a challenge, and then they come back after they've been signed with keys, etc. Normally we'd go directly from A to B, but with this one, because we've got an intermediary in the middle, they can accept as somebody who the as Alice thinks she's communicating with B, but actually it's I, and then I is able to relay that communication to B. Because they're able to pass through the intermediary, they're able to see everything in that communication channel as open, right? But A and B, so Alice and Bob, are in complete trust at this point. They don't see anything wrong with the communication. So this is really dangerous if we're operating in highly sort of secure environments where we want to trust data. It can be very problematic because we wouldn't know, if we have a high level of trust, that we've been intercepted. Target conditioning. This one's an interesting one because this is what I mentioned earlier on about where we gradually introduce data to have an impact on the planning system in some way. So the example I put here is actually not to do with planning, it's basically to do with data classification, but it gets the idea across quite nicely. So if we had a very simple two-class data classification problem using, I don't know, a support vector machine, and we've got our hyperplane in the middle, and if over time we were to introduce some small, fake data, synthetic data in there, which is not true, we could influence the hyperplane separation, right? Now here it doesn't actually look to have any adverse impact, but over time we could probably change it quite significantly, gradually, and that could have impact on the system. And if we have some pre-processing in our planning system with some machine learning perhaps running, it could become quite easy for somebody then to look to do this kind of target conditioning to manipulate some sort of high-level classification which feeds into the planning system afterwards. So we've got the repackaging capability signatures again. So this one is where we'd be looking to sort of create new deceptive profiles in the network. So the attack that I've got here is masquerading, where we've got the adversary who's basically pretending to be a vehicle in the system, right? And they're pretending to be that vehicle, probably to do something quite malicious overall, where they're either creating a vehicle to make the network more congested, influence decisions, maybe influence vehicle-to-vehicle decisions that are being made. Maybe they want to simply send communication to another vehicle, but they realise that to do that, they have to pretend to be an actual valid vehicle. These could be quite difficult attacks to launch in a system, but if successful, could have quite significant consequences. The next one, amplification. So this one, we could be looking to make the transport network appear more congested than it really is. So the earlier on we had the opposite of this one. This one could be where the adversary wants to make the desired route that somebody wants to go on appear very congested, so that the planning algorithm puts them on an alternative route, which could be at higher cost to the victim, or it might be comparable, but they're doing it for their own benefit, right? So for some reason, the adversary is going to win from that. Whether that's something like it's more desirable for them to travel down that route, or maybe they're looking to optimize how vehicles flow through the network to, I don't know, drive past certain locations for marketing purposes. There are many reasons as to why you might want to influence this without them being particularly dangerous. Then we've got reinforcing the position. So this one, we're looking at spoofing here, where we're wanting to make the traffic controller believe that one or more vehicles are taking a course of action when a different one is actually taken. So we want the controller to believe that we're on this route where actually we're taking another one. So we're kind of wanting to hide from the controller here and travel without them knowing where we actually are. So we've gone over those examples there. Now, one thing that I want to mention about them is that obviously not all is equal, right? There's a scale with these deceptive behaviours, particularly with their impact, right? So what they cause as the final result. We know that the attacker has the first mover advantage. I mentioned that a few times, and that we can't foresee all the attacks. And we know that the rate of new attacks is high. So therefore, really, we need some way of prioritising significance. So when a new attack is discovered, and we can think about how it could link to sort of deceptive behaviours that an attacker might launch, we can then try to prioritise them, score them, and understand which one we might want to address first. So I'm going to go over a few dimensions now, linked to some research we did and published in the paper at the end that I'm going to mention. The first dimension is time frame, where really this one's probably the most easy to explain, really, where the attack is going to be happening over a short to a long time, or long duration. I've got an example here of a short and a long attack. So if we think of a short one, it could be denial of service, which is something quite quick to do, quite quick impact, right? Where we just look to overload some receiver in the system and cause them to, plan differently. A long one could be a poisoning attack, where gradually we introduce some false information, which very gradually changes something, the learning capabilities going on within the system, and influences them in the long run. The different time frames are quite significant because it's of time investment for the adversary. The engagement, so how easy is it for the adversary to launch this attack? So an easy one, denial of service again, because these are often just launching data packets in high volumes at the receiver. Quite easy to do. Ones that are more highly technically involved are things like spoofing and masquerading, where the attacks are likely to require in-depth knowledge of what is going on in the system and how the adversary needs to manipulate or interfere with those technical processes and protocols. It's not so much just send data. There's a lot more involved there. It's quite important to consider the engagement, because if something is easy to do, then it's obviously likely to be more attractive to people with lower technical capability, potentially, which could mean it's open to a larger number of people to perform. Whereas something that requires a high level of engagement probably is going to be something that requires somebody with great technical depth and requires quite a lot of time as well. Then we can think about the infrastructure. So how much of the system which our planning technologies is controlling is impacted by this? Is it a small aspect, or is it multiple? Is it systemic through it? So if we think of single, we could be launching sort of an interception attack between two devices communicating, could have quite a narrow impact. Or we could be overloading many infrastructure components, having a wide scale impact. And this is obviously very important to consider as well, because something that has a large scale impact, impacting on many infrastructure components, is potentially going to have a greater impact overall, right? It could be something that really could be difficult to prevent once it starts. Where something that's only got a single component might not be too problematic, because it might be overcome. We might be able to overcome that by having alternatives in place and suitable backups and redundancy in the system. So then to the scale, which is closely linked, we've got things which are we've got attacks which could be local or systemic. So things that are local, also there's an overlap here between how many, or what's the involvement of the infrastructure and also the scale, really. But scale, we're looking at the size of the actual attack, right? So if it's local, such as session hijacking, it's probably communication between a couple of devices. Whereas if we're looking at something systemic, we might be looking at something like flooding, really impacting on distribution across a large area of the network. Sort of like a distributed denial of service attack launching against many parts. Then if we look at the impact, so how does this all come together, and what's the final impact on the actual application? Well, this is measured in sort of low to high terms, and this is the one that's probably most important, really, for the end user to consider. So things that have a low impact could be things such as like snooping and masquerading, where the localized, the impact could just be purely on data receiving, maybe a little bit of data manipulation and representing something in the system which is not true but quite small. It could have quite large engagement and time frame dimension involvement, but in terms of the impact, it could potentially be quite low in the overall application if we're thinking of traffic control. Whereas flooding, this one could be quite significant and quite large, where we'd be expecting to see a large portion of the network flooded by data, which could take it offline and could result in quite a large impact, because a lot of the network could become unresponsive and unusable. So the collective use of this kind of dimension approach can be quite beneficial, because it allows us to represent different attacks and consider their involvement with different aspects of the automation and planning system, and then probably better understand what mitigation we could then consider. So as you can see here by looking at the diagram, when we've got something like denial of service, we can see that the impact can be quite high, but the engagement is medium. It's not that high really, but the time frame is very low. Whereas if we look at something like poisoning, we see that the time frame is high, the engagement is high because it's quite challenging and difficult to do. The impact could be medium. I mean, this is subjective, right? It could change depending on what sort of application environment you're considering and how you're evaluating what the adversary could potentially go on to achieve with that attack. Now, finally, I just want to finish off with some thoughts on mitigation and how different mitigation approaches are going to be needed to attack this kind of problem, because it's not entirely a technological solution, right? Although technology will play quite a part in it, the systems are likely to always be vulnerable to some certain extent. So if we ever think about technocentric solutions first of all, so we can obviously design and develop the systems to be more resilient to adversarial attack. But this is challenging, because although this is possible, you can't always foresee what's coming, right? So yes, you could make it so that the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and the easy ways to attack the system could be removed. The system could become more resilient. The highly skilled adversary is likely still to find a way to introduce some deceptive attack into the system if they want to. Now that could come at great expense in terms of time, but if the reward is high, then they will pursue it, right? So that is obviously going to be challenging. Now this could probably be semi overcome by then looking at deployment and how we monitor the solutions once they're in place to find unusual behaviours. So if you think of like traffic management systems, for example, is there a need to better monitor what's going on with how the planning system is generating plans and how the inputs are influencing that generation, to look for something which is potentially suspicious, malicious even, and what should happen with that. But that in itself could also be problematic, because monitoring systems too, as we know in the security field, are open to being manipulated, and you can launch deception attacks against them also. So it's going to be very challenging really to overcome this entirely in a techno-centric solution. So there's probably going to be a bit of a need for the human factors really, for educating people about how to detect and respond to things that could be suspicious. So when it comes to traffic management, for example, as just an application that we keep coming back to, there's a good reason for why you might want to educate the users to think about why or how the system might be giving them something which is odd, to basically observe what's going on and to actually not just take the system as fact. But obviously we don't want them to question it all the way, because then they might decide to not trust it. So there needs to be a high level of trust, but they should be aware where they can understand that it's not behaving correctly. So I suppose this is, there's an analogy here really with just, IT systems, where early desktop processors were highly vulnerable and people did not really understand when it was compromised. Whereas now they're not as vulnerable as before. A lot of the attacks come through trying to attack and deceive the human. And it's also a case now that humans are, the users are a lot wise to what a security attack probably looks like and when the system is behaving suspicious, and can probably find a way to intercept and even solve that problem. Whereas in some areas where automation might be in its early adoption stage, that doesn't really exist. And then another one to consider is legislation and enforcement. There's going to be a need to regulate and to introduce consequences around this area, and to make sure that adversaries, if they do something which is of significant consequence and they can be traced and identified, then they should be prosecuted. And like most areas of IT, there should be also some pressure on the sort of developer maintenance of autonomous systems, to make sure that the security aspects are taken seriously, right, and that people are not just leaving them vulnerable and aren't taking the correct precautions. So just to provide a conclusion then, before we have time before I have time to answer some questions, the nature of autonomous systems creates a potential for deception. Different actors will have different motivations as to why they want to deceive. Security vulnerabilities create a very viable attack surface, and a way that the attack itself can launch a deceptive behaviour. But not all are equal, and there is a need to understand their dimensions for comparison, and that's why I presented them dimensions and some earlier work we've done there. And presenting against deception is going to be challenging, right? There's no doubt about that. So further work is certainly needed here. So just to provide the references for those who are interested to find more information on this work, and also the references I mentioned in the table earlier on. So the paper here, 2020, that's the one where you'll find the references, and an earlier one based on early work with understanding the threats in cyber in CAV systems. You can find that here too. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you.